The spoon tapped the saucer like a tiny machine learning the rhythm of a life about to change. Elena felt it as a cold thing under her palm, a small, regular noise that cut through the hummed baritone of the jazz sax and the citrus scent of lemon oil polished into the banquette. It was the kind of sound she listened for, the barcode of a room, a signal that allowed her to read the people crossing it. She knew when a regular was tired before he spoke. She could tell the difference between a napkin folded to hide a phone and one folded to show a tip. That day, the tapping threaded itself into every movement like a metronome, and for once, she let the rhythm pull her attention away from the orders. Marco was at his usual table at the far corner, a dark silhouette softened by low light, a watch that caught whatever light there was and threw it back in a small, private way. People rearranged themselves around him because rooms knew how to defer. Servers took a wider arc when they passed. Rosa, the manager, left an empty place at the end of the counter that didn't need explanation. Marco's presence shaped the evening like a rain shadow. He never raged. He never needed to. His gestures were small and precise. Thumb on a glass rim, a single floral nod, and the room rearranged itself on those gestures. Elena was tenacious about small signals. By day, she kept worksheets and lecture slides folded inside her bag. By night, she carried a pen at her wrist and the capacity to notice the things others missed. She noticed the penciled circle first. It was the last mark on a receipt that had been folded into a customer's bill when a regular had asked for the check. The mark was hardly more than 3 faint curves, as if someone had circled a time and then stopped. People circled times all the time, reservations, orders, the shorthand that meant little more than remember. But this circle had purpose. It sat beside a small name written in a hand that felt half drunken and half careful. Lucia. Lucia, Marco's wife, had a name. Elena had seen the woman once before, an elegant silhouette that slipped out of the restaurant with a hand on Marco's forearm, a laugh that sounded like glass. People like Lucia moved through the room without leaving fingerprints. They were ornaments that returned the light. A name on a folded scrap did not prove anything. Names on scraps rarely did. But some scraps grow teeth when someone who knows the mouth to feed them puts them in the wrong pocket. Elena almost slid the receipt into the tip jar by accident. The gesture was so small she almost convinced herself there had been nothing purposeful about it. She straightened the napkins, wiped a table, and felt the paper's folded edge in the pocket of her apron like an undesired coin. She should have left it. She should have let it sleep like everything else. But she had a habit, partly out of thrift, partly out of curiosity, of stacking scraps that could become maps.
When the kitchen slowed for a lull, she unfolded it under the bar's dim light and read the scrawl again. There was another mark beneath the name, a street and a time, Old Dock, 9:30. Below that, in a different ink, a phone number. She might have told herself it was nothing, an ordinary misdelivered note. The difference was this. At 9:30 the week before, she had served a man who smelled of cologne and nervous breath and had left an empty glass where his hands had been. He had walked out with a woman whose laughter snagged on the corner like a borrowed scarf. Elena had told herself these were separate things. Now, the pencil circle made a map. Rumors are small things, like twigs pushed by wind, and they can catch quickly if someone gives them breath. Rosa noticed Elena's distracted face. "You okay?" she asked, already knowing the answer a quarter turn before Elena had it. Rosa's eyes were practical and quick to rearrange. The restaurant was a machine, and Elena had a minor but necessary gear. "I'm fine," Elena said. She tucked the receipt back into the pocket and moved to refill the salt shakers. Her fingers remembered the rhythm of the place, and she tried to forget the circle. It gave her a headache like citrus. A rumor did not need speech to do its work. A half-side word over the coffee machine, Lucia again, became a sighting. The penciled circle changed hands with the same economy as a coin. Louis, the bartender, lifted his chin when he thought no one was watching, and made a face that meant, "Not again." Tomas hummed, louder, to cover the conversation from the table by the window. It was not long before someone dropped the scrap into the book that Marco used to keep his restaurant affairs in order, the ledger where he kept tabs on things that should not leak into daylight. The book was not officially his. It was Rosa's old accounting ledger, but people gave names the way they give power. The page where the penciled circle now sat was thin with other notations, a slipped payment, a promise of repairs, a note to check on a delivery. Someone underlined the time in a hurried hand. That night, Marco did not talk. He listened. He watched the room and adjusted the habits of everyone in it as if he were tuning an instrument. At 23 minutes past midnight, he rose and walked out without paying the bill. People watched his silhouette across the street like a weather satellite tracking a storm. No one followed. They had been trained to know what following looked like, and this was not following so much as a slow pivot in the city's axis. When he returned, he called Elena aside with a motion that felt casual,
only because he had practiced casual until it became ritual. He did not summon her at his table, he did not shout. He folded his hands like he was measuring the length of something with them, and invited her to stand with him by the door, where the sacks and the lemon oil could not interrupt them. "You see things," he said.
It was not a question. Elena's hand went to the pin on her wrist before she could stop it, the familiar gesture that made her feel as if she were keeping score of the world. Saying no would be simpler. Saying nothing would be safer. But there was the penciled circle, and with it the stubbornness of a woman who could not unsee ink on paper. "I saw a receipt," she said. Her voice was small. "A name, Lucia. A time." Marco's knife of a smile did not sharpen. It folded like paper. He was not a man who dramatized. He did not rise from his chair to take up space. He did not have to. He inclined his head as if receiving a gift. "Thank you," he said. He held out a hand. In his palm lay a small slip of paper and a pen. No one else watched, but the street lamps recorded them with a bland, impartial light. "I want you to do something for me," Marco said. The words were folded into the same economy that guided the rest of his life. "Give me the scrap. Put everything you find into this envelope. Hand it to Rosa. She will put it in the ledger. Do not—" He paused, the only trace of heat in him a shadow behind his eyes. "Do not tell anyone." It was not a threat so much as a law. He was making a ritual out of control. Elena could tell when something was in order and when it was an expectation. He did not raise his voice. It would have ruined the economy of the room. Orders come soft in those circuits because a raised voice is a sloppy instrument. She handed the receipt over. The paper slid across her palm like a fish. It was a small, obscene exchange. Marco folded the receipt into his fingers as if it were a delicate thing and tucked it away. "Keep your head down," he said, and walked back into the lacquered shadow of his table. That should have been the end. A receipt passed across a hand and the ledger swallowed it. The city has many private arrangements that do not make it to police files. But Marco's discovery was not a small thing to him. It was not a small affront. Men like Marco measure certain disarrays with a seriousness that is not given to other sorts of human grief. The penciled circle was a misalignment in his world. How he decided to respond would be the thing that altered the map. The next morning, Elena came in before her class to stack the chairs and turn on the lights. The restaurant smelled of lemon oil and last night's coffee, and she kept thinking of the two names on the receipt as if they were coordinates on a map. Marta, her grandmother, had left a wrapped roll of bread in the staff fridge the night before. Marta's hands were careful with bread the way she was careful with people, wrapping them, pushing them away from the heat. Marta asked how the night had gone, and Elena kept her eyes under the kettle spout and said, "Quiet." Later that afternoon, Inspector Hale came to the restaurant. He was not a man who entered because he had been invited. He walked in as if the room had been part of his beat since childhood. He was trim, with the sort of handshake that showed he had learned to carry pressure in his palm. He noted things with a look that cataloged them: the lemon-scented counter, the way the napkins were folded, the ledger on the manager's desk that was never quite closed. Elena felt the freedom of her silence slip under that look, like something being tugged through narrow teeth. "You work here?" Hale asked, soft. Elena nodded. Her voice had become thinner, an instrument with the same strings pulled too often. He took his notebook out, a small utilitarian thing, and wrote down her name in neat block letters. He did not ask for the receipt. He did not need to. "We had a report," he said. "Something that could be relevant. Has Marco told anyone?" She said no. She had given the scrap to Marco. She had intended to be obedient. But the city had other languages. Hale's eyes looked like a man who heard things coming late and wanted to catch them in his hands. "Listen," Hale said. "If something crosses your path, if you see anything that feels like more than gossip, bring it to us. We can put you in a safe house for a short period. We can file for witness protection if it comes to that. We can collect evidence properly. But we have rules. Chain of custody. We can't build a case if the paper goes missing or if someone touches it without us seeing. If you're willing to help, we can make you a protected person." He said it like a negotiation. He didn't promise miracles. He spoke in small legalities. "If you hand us the thing in an evidence bag, we seal it, sign the form, and it got locked. We don't want your life to change more than it has to." He was legal and tired and perfectly procedural. Elena could give the paper to Marco as she had been told and watch him put it into his private chest. She could lie and say she had not seen anything.
She could do nothing. Those were the simple choices available to someone who had to pay rent and keep a schedule that allowed for classes at night. But she had a weakness for being honest in a room that rewarded half-truths. I didn't keep it, she said. I gave it to him. Hale nodded like a man closing a loop he had known would close. Then tell me everything you remember. We'll fill the gaps. The police process was banal to watch. Claire, the forensic analyst, arrived with a heavy-lidded bag and a calm voice that smelled of dust and formaldehyde. She handled items with gloves the way other people handled birds. Claire photographed the ledger page, set the penciled circle beneath a lamp, and made a diplomatic face as she told Elena that handwriting could be analyzed, but that it only took people so far. Paper ties things, she said, but paper can also be planted. We note that, Violet. Marco's reaction once the police were involved was less immediate than expected. He did not storm in to tear the ledger from Rose's hands. He did not send a message that demanded blood.
He sat with the news like a man tasting something bitter. He called several men in his orbit and asked for reports. He arranged for a small envelope of money to be sent to a woman in a different town for repairs to a building no one had the authority to question. The moves were not noisy. They did not demand guns. They were administrative. A check here, a quiet conversation there. They were the soft currency of someone who had learned to command not through spectacle, but through infrastructure. Elena had expected fury and found instead the cold logic of an operator. The world responds to insults. Marco cataloged which kind of response fit this insult. Not petty, not theatrical, not bloody unless the calculus said it must be. Instead, he surprised everyone by choosing a different currency, paper and signature. Bring everything, he told Elena. All notes, all scraps. Put them in the envelope. He spoke as if this were a domestic task. We will not have violence, not for this. That word, not, floated over them like a decree. For people in the room, it had the effect of stopping a possible explosion in its tracks. Some were relieved. Some, especially those who had lived under the idea that power meant physical finality, felt the absence of that violence as if the world had become dangerously slippery. Marco's choice was to refuse the obvious path of rage and instead enact a kind of structural punishment. He reached into the ledger and drew a line under the penciled circle. He made a list. He drafted a page that announced that there would be consequences, but of the predictable, bureaucratic kind. Why? Elena asked him once, when she caught him in the alley behind the restaurant, insanely ordinary place for a man like him to be shadowed. He had a cigarette between his fingers, though he did not smoke. It was for the image of not being startled. He looked at her with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with her. Because violence is a language you only use when you're certain it will make the problem simpler, he said. Sometimes the problem becomes simpler by making the wrongdoer disappear from the map. Sometimes they are easiest handled by making them bankrupt. He described his idea precisely, as if he were discussing a ledger line. He could use his circuits to freeze accounts, to redirect payments that landed in the lovers' pockets back into municipal coffers, to get inspectors to check invoices. He could insert a bureaucratic pin into someone's flow until the water stopped. He could force a complicity of quiet men to sign away a life. You understand, he said, and his eyes said he expected she did not. It was an unbelievable move, only because stories told us that men like him would do the dramatic thing. There are always movies that need a gun. But Marco preferred a quieter geometry. His repertoire included quiet ruin.
He offered the promise of no blood, and offered in compensation exile and procedural annihilation. Power wore itself like a glove and pressed hard. That was the moment the story pivoted. He made a choice that redefined what was on the table. He would not burn a life to avenge himself. He would instead remove the offense from his sight by engineering its erasure. He would weaponize paperwork, reputations, and the municipal apparatus. It was not noble. It was precise. It was, in its way, a kind of violence. He asked Elena to be his intermediary more than once, and she said no. Once was for fear, once was for principle, once was for hunger. Yet when the ledger's entries were given to Inspector Hale, Elena signed an acknowledgement. She handed the pieces into the evidence bag in a public, recorded way. Claire photographed every crease, logged every smudge. The chain of custody filled out in Hale's careful hand. Item 1, receipt, penciled circle, name, Lucia, time, 9:30. Elena watched him tape the evidence bag and slide it into a secured box. Her name was on the log now. She was a witness. The city had recorded her in its files. Marco's signature came later, in a different light. He called a small meeting at a neutral place, a lawyer's office whose windows let in little but the clean air of indifference. He sat at the end of the table and pushed a page forward. It was not a confession, it was an agreement, a document that looked like a protection contract and also like an administrative decree. He signed it. The paper read like law, if law was made of softened leather instead of statute books. It said he would withdraw certain public gestures and allow the woman he had been married to go to a place where danger could not find her. It included the ugly terms of exile, no more appearances, no more public dinners, a financial package that would be transferred under strict conditions. In essence, he purchased silence and safety, but the currency was not peace so much as removal. He left his mark on the page with a precise flourish. The signature clung to the paper the way a scar clings to skin, permanent and with the power to change how the face looked in future lights. The absence of violence did not make the scene humane. The document demanded things that felt near violent: exile, disgrace, the theft of a place in the world. Marco's move protected Lucia by removing her from the circle of his life, but it made protection a transaction. He bought her a different world where she would live apart and anonymous, replaced by a carefully paid quietness. He used infrastructure, not muscle. The unbelievability was in the way he refused the simple story and chose instead to orchestrate a rearrangement that would be felt for years in the margins of people's lives. The middle of the story finned into the procedural. Hale took the receipt and the data and treated them with the efficiency of an instrument that had been passed down.
Claire examined the phone number, traced the account that had paid for dinners, followed the breadcrumb trail to a shell company registered under a name that meant nothing to most people. The forensic lab found nothing dramatic, no DNA, no clandestine prints, but they did find bank transfers that moved money around in quiet loops. Those loops, when traced, led to a man who was small in comparison to a man like Marco, but who had a payroll that fed a number of things, including the woman. It was not dramatic. It was adult and messy. The law was not a spectacular sword, but a map of ledgers, dates, signatures. Arrests followed in a sterile way. Subpoenas, quiet interviews, an accountant who meant little in the larger theater, but who had signed the wrong form in the wrong order. The lovers were not dragged out screaming. They were given paper and a chance to make themselves vulnerable in tiny lexical units. The charges were not for infidelity, they never were, but for fraud and misdirection, invoices that didn't match the work, transfers that showed a pattern. The punishment was the sucking sound of credit drying, reputations withering. It was quieter than the movies, but felt worse in its aftermath because people still had to see each other's faces per the contracts they'd once signed. Elena became a part of the mechanism she had feared. She had signed the receipt over, she had watched Claire lift the images, she had given a statement that cataloged what she had seen in language that would be awkward to live with later. Hale drove her once to a safe house the police maintained, a small apartment with a key card and cataloged linens. Short period, he said, the phrase rehearsed into a hollow comfort. The house smelled of bleach and a faint attempt at hospitality. It had a kettle the wrong size for its stove. There, alone with other people's careful rules, Elena felt the cost of her choice. She had not imagined that the world would ask that she carry this, paper, a signature, the tag of a witness in a box, across the street with a face. Her life rearranged itself in minute ways. Morning alarms pushed earlier to miss dawn buses, envelopes in her mailbox with no return address, Tomas dropping by with the kind of noise meant to make her feel less watched. Marta, when Elena told her what had happened, pressed a piece of bread into her palm and said, "You did right, you did the right thing." Marta's judgment was simple and did not require the complexity of indignation. It was Brad in a hand. The midpoint shifted because Marco's choice refocused who the enemy was. He did not choose to loose an animal upon those who hurt him. He chose to make the world finish those people in quieter ways. The lovers' lives unraveled under audits and closed doors. One of them left town quietly in the middle of the night, carrying the residue of a life that had been pulled into a bureaucratic net. The woman, Lucia, took the offer of protection. She signed the papers and left with a small suitcase and no goodbyes. Marco did not stand at the door to watch. He had arranged for her removal in such a way that when she left, it looked as if no one had noticed. But everyone had noticed. The ledger had been altered. A chapter had been cut out. This was not justice in any idealized sense. It was a different kind of punishment, and at the center of it, a transaction. Elena felt both relief and disgust in equal measures. She had wanted to keep her head down. She had wanted to show a life the grace of not exploding. Now she had watched a life be erased from a neighborhood as if it were an unwanted chair. Protection in this arrangement meant exile. The cost lodged in her throat as if she had swallowed a small stone. Marco's act had consequences that rippled outward in slow circles. A local councilwoman who had taken his donations for community projects found that those accounts were no longer funded. The festival that used to line the street with white flags and music had a hole in its budget and had to find new sponsors. It was not mere abstention on Marco's part when he withdrew support. It was a visible concession of power, a strange, almost sacrificial move that made him less of a public god and more like a man who could still apply pressure, just in less visible ways. People in the neighborhood noticed. They had been fed for years by the soft currency of his philanthropy. Now they had to seek a new kind of generosity. Elena's own life, too, rearranged itself. Tomas, her friend and handyman, came by the safe house with his hands thick with tools and his humming like someone playing the same song to calm himself. He fixed a crooked shelf and left quietly with a bag of bulging items and the kind of silence that meant worry. Rosa covered for Elena at work for a week, then another, and Elena learned to live by more cautious rituals. The pen in her pocket was heavier, her notes circled with a small, compulsive hand. Everything she touched felt like evidence. There were moments of tenderness in the interim. Marta came to the door of the safe house with a warm roll and a bowl of lentils that smelt like slow summers. "You are not the only one who has had to carry something," Marta said, and told the story of a neighbor who had once hidden a letter from a man she did not love. "We make our choices. Not all of them are clean, but music gets played even when the room changes." Inspector Hale was quiet at times, the way people are who have learned to keep their voices for the exact moment when procedures matter. He would appear with a folder and a face that had been taught to show no false promise. "We got what we needed," he said once. "We can't promise miracles. Fraud cases take time. Accounts close. People get charged. The legal system moves slowly."
He sounded tired, not because he had been working, but because the world asks men like him to be the tremor dampers in other people's storms. Claire, by contrast, had a humor of a different temperature. She made Elena tea in small paper cups and told the story of a pen that had once been used to sign something important. "You would be surprised what people think is permanent," Claire said. "They sign in a red room and then wonder why the paper went away." Her hands were perpetually clad in gloves, as if she would next reach out to lift a galaxy and drop it into a box. Elena's choice, once made, rewired the way people looked at her. Some looked with gratitude that had the hoof marks of guilt. Others looked at her with a small, careful envy for a life she had not chosen to have, the kind of visibility that dragged other people's violence into light. There were nights when she had a dream that she was folding napkins in a strange rhythm, and each fold revealed a different map. She woke up with the taste of lemon oil and the sound of Marco's watch on her tongue. One evening, after a week of quiet, there was a court hearing that read like something in a manual. Cross-examination, ledgers, signatures, an accountant who agreed to a plea. It was not melodramatic. It was the slow, procedural method of the state eating away at a house built on small satisfactions. Sentences were discussed behind closed doors. Payments moved to offset irregularities. The levers were not ruined so much as marginalized. The scandal did what scandals do in a small town. It rerouted gossip into railings and left the people with the burned edges of their reputations. Where the story expected blood, the law provided forms and fines. Where vengeance would have been exhibitionist, the system offered administrative erasure. That was when the social cost of Marco's move came into focus. He had chosen not to turn to spectacle, but to bureaucratic pressure. It was cleaner. It was, in his terms, less wasteful. But it left damaged lives in its wake in ways that were not immediately visible. Jobs lost, friendships broken, a woman's name filed off the public calendar in favor of an enforced anonymity. Elena found herself thinking about the shape of the loss. How do you measure exile compared to a life taken? Both left a shadow. The community's theater of response was diminished but not placid. People whispered at the market and watched the doorways for any sign that something would repeat itself. Marco's withdrawal of public gifts made him less present at community dinners. He sent emissaries instead. People who had once stood in line for his favors now looked to other people for help. In some ways, the world was cleaner. In others, it had lost something that could not be replaced. Elena wondered whether that loss was rightful or simply collateral. There were moments when she resented him, and moments when she admired the clarity of the economy he had used.
He had chosen to avoid blood, but his avoidance meant someone else's life would be made small as if by erasure. The moral ledger was not balanced, it tilted. As weeks became months, Elena settled into a new rhythm. She resumed classes and learned to carry the knowledge that the world required compromises. Rosa found a replacement for Elena's shifts by arranging an evening schedule that allowed for classes. Tomas fixed the front stoop of Marta's building and hummed when he put his hand on the rail. Elena taught herself small rituals to cope. She carried a pen that she had bought after her old one had been requisitioned as evidence. It was heavy and marked with a tiny chip on its barrel. She would circle small things on the back of receipts and then unfold them to make a map of her days. The pen was not only a tool, but a talisman. She would tap it against the ledger's margin and imagine herself owning the weight of what she had done. On a damp afternoon, when the sky felt as if it might spill a long, low rain, Marco came to the restaurant not as a ruler, but as an observer. He sat at his old table and ordered no more than an espresso. He had not made a show of his withdrawal. The room had the memory of him. People were polite, but not effusive. He watched the street through his glass, and occasionally his hand turned his watch so the face caught the light and made a slow flare. Elena served him the coffee and left a sugar packet on the saucer. He lifted his head and said, "You did what you had to do." His sentence was not a statement of praise or concession. It was an acknowledgement of a truth he had already catalogued. Elena's throat tightened with an answer that wanted to be both gratitude and culpability. "It didn't feel like doing the right thing sometimes," she said. He smiled, small and almost apologetic. "Right is a luxury in certain rooms," he said. "We do what makes the map possible. Sometimes the cost is not clean." There were weeks where Elena thought she would never understand the arithmetic of cost. She had watched the lovers' lives thin out, and she had watched a woman leave town with a bag that was full of small, unforgivable silences. She had signed statements and allowed her name to be placed in a file. The city had a new chapter in its ledger. People had been rearranged. Marco had given up visible power and in exchange had applied his networks to erase an embarrassment. He had, in effect, done the unbelievable. He chose administration over muscle. But the choice did not absolve him. It made him more complicated. He had not been benevolent. He had been practical. He had chosen exile as a form of mercy that doubled as punishment. He had given a woman safety that resembled exile. He had made the lovers pay in credit and reputation. And Elena, who had been a small gear in the machine, watched those cogs chew through lives and realized that carrying a witness card made her more visible and more fragile.
There was a final exchange that arrived months later, small as a folded receipt left in a book. Marta found it first. It was a key ring, brass and worn, tucked into a small folder between bread crusts and the morning paper. On the ring hung a single pen clipped into a loop. There was also the penciled circle, now replicated with a steady hand, around a time and a place. It was nothing more than an echo of the first piece of paper Elena had seen, a ritual return. The key ring meant nothing to most people. It was the sort of talisman a man might leave to mark charity paid in exact measures. But the key ring, the pen, the receipt, were all parts of a sequence that felt like an answer. Elena carried the key ring in her pocket like a bone, an object of weight. She would hold it in her hand during long lectures and press the pen's cap into the pad of her finger when she thought about the ledger. It reminded her that small things had the power to redirect lives. There was one last small meeting. Inspector Hale met with Elena in a municipal office that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. He handed her a log, and on the page they had kept of her testimony he had written Item 1 next to a short line. "We closed the case as much as we could," he said. "The charges stuck where they could. Some people took plea deals, some moved away. There's not much more the state can do without more evidence." He folded his hands on the desk like a man who had learned to keep promises small. Elena asked, "Did they hurt anyone?" Hale's face did not change. "Not physically," he said. "We put pressure where it would have an effect. That is what we can do. The city is not a clean instrument." Elena left the office with a small satisfaction and the remainder of a moral fog. She had given the paper, and the police had done what they could. Marco had done what he chose to do. He had signed away the spectacle, and Lucia had been removed from the circuit, safe but taken from the world she had known. The lovers' affairs were no longer matters for gossip so much as ledger lines at an accountant's office. There were consequences that were not legal. Everyone who had been part of the episode had to learn a new arrangement. Rosa had to manage the ledger with an added care, scrubbing entries and keeping small things under lock. Thomas's humming became more frequent. Louis, the bartender, stopped making idle bets on how people would behave. The world had content for him now that had no entertainment value. Elena's classes continued at night. She passed exams with a new ferocity that came from someone who had been made to count small things with greater attention. She learned to like a life with smaller certainties. In the end, the pen and the keyring and the penciled circle became a private constellation she kept in a drawer. She would take them out on rare mornings and wonder if the shape of what she had done could be measured by such small objects.
Marco's decision had been the seed that split the map. It had been an action of strategic restraint. It had refused the theater of vengeance and chosen instead the theater of erasure. The unbelievable thing he did was to step away from spectacle and instead reconfigure the city's administrative appetite until it consumed the offense. It was not noble. It was not a victory. It was a choice that left a trail of small, bitter consequences in its wake. Elena thought of Lucia sometimes, of the woman who had once laughed like glass near the espresso machine, and felt a grief like a paper cut, small, persistent, and sharp. On an evening in late spring, when the street lights were still wet from rain, Elena stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant and watched Marco put his watch in his pocket. He did so as if controlling a clock could allow him to measure what he had lost or what he had saved. He did not look toward her specifically, and she did not look away. She had learned a kind of lucidity about men like him. Power, she knew now, did not always announce itself with fury. Sometimes it hid in signatures and in the patient closing of accounts. She placed her hand in her pocket and felt the keyring warm its way against her skin. The pen on it was a little chipped from use. The penciled circle was no longer a thing that could topple a kingdom, only a small signal on which a life had turned. She carried it like a map. What would you have done? She asked herself one last time, not looking for absolution and not hoping for an easy answer. The real question had no single solution. She had chosen to deliver the paper into a process that promised a kind of justice, slow and bureaucratic. And Marco had chosen the instrument by which the world should punish, not with fever, but with the steady stroke of paper across table. People in the city continued to gossip. They still made their wagers and kept their eyes on the corner table. But the room had adjusted to a new scale. The festival moved forward with new sponsors. Lucia was nowhere to be seen. The lovers' names were muted in conversations, like photographs left in the rain. In the drawer of her kitchen she kept the pen and the keyring, and folded beneath them a sheet of paper on which she had, on a rare night of clarity, circled a single time and pressed her finger against it until the ink sank. It smelled faintly of lemon oil. It was not much, but it was a thing she could hold. When people asked her what happened, neighbors who wanted the excised gossip, Elena would tell them only part of the story. A man of power discovered a betrayal and chose an unbelievable way to formalize restraint. He made a wound into a contract and sent a woman away. She would not tell the rest unless they asked for it. Most people did not ask. They were satisfied with the outline and the sense that the world had been returned to some kind of calm.
At night, when the rain pressed small glass beads against the window, Elena would draw a small circle on an old receipt for no reason other than to feel the motion steady her hand. She would place the pen in the pocket of her jacket and walk to class. The keyring stayed in the drawer most of the time. It was a small, heavy thing that marked the place where she had stood and the way she had been moved. In the quiet that followed the decision, she learned how to measure what she had carried and to whom the weight belonged. If you find yourself thinking of what you would have done, know this: the choices people make in rooms like that are not dramatic in the ways the movies teach us to expect. They are quiet and they are precise, and the consequences are carried in the small habits that follow. Elena had learned that the spoon's tap can tell the time a life changes, and the penciled circle can become a map. She had signed her name once on a page as someone who had seen, and she had learned that being seen is both shelter and vulnerability. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more quiet moral thrillers.